Welcome, everyone. We're back for another session of Productivity Power Hour. And today I wanted to sort of continue the line of discussion that we were having from last week, where we were talking about metrics and success. Metrics and success. But I move on to a different topic, specifically about something that's been bothering me for quite some time, which is about project management. And so this is not a stream necessarily about project management like as a job, but more like something that I've noticed that as an individual who has a lot of open source projects, things I try to do on the side, there's work stuff, and then just life things. Like managing those things has been notoriously difficult, and we'll talk a little bit about my background when we get into it. But it's a problem that I don't think has been really spent a lot of time on for different reasons. And I thought, one, it'd be fun to talk about with the chat, and then we sort of go over it. Love to talk about some of the ideas, models, frameworks that I've come up with to start to maybe tease apart the problem a bit so that we can eventually, hopefully, tackle it in some way. But anyhow, so yeah, that's what we're here for. So with that, let's go ahead and switch on over to the live screen. All right. So first thing first, let's set a base level with everyone as far as project management and what it means to people on a normal basis, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and let's make this into a new note and go ahead and refactor that. And then, this is a new workflow that I'm testing out. So ignore that for now. All right. So the very first question we have here is around this idea of what project management is. And so I think most of us, when we think of project management, and as always, please feel free to drop your thoughts as far as project management in the chat. Basically, it's a specialized role on a team that is responsible for making sure that deadlines are being held to, right? I think that's probably its biggest metric of impact, right? So what do we say? So specialists on the team, primarily centered around the metric of deadlines and helping the team make progress. And so this happens in a number of different ways, right? Project managers' jobs are incredibly valuable, and they do so much for the team as far as helping to make sure we align like business values along with sort of product needs, with engineering, with design. It's a really key linchpin in a lot of teams. And so the thing is, though, when we think about it this way, though, it's like, okay, so we have this person that is doing all this deadline management stuff. But a lot of times, though, the thing about project management that I've struggled with a bit is that it's always done on a team. And not because there's anything wrong with this, but the funny thing is, as individuals, we have a lot of different things we're also trying to manage. And we all probably have various coping mechanisms for how we like figure out what's available and what time we have for things. But the truth is, I think a lot of us just kind of do our best with what we can remember. And then we forget about certain things get on fire, and then the cycle just kind of continues on itself. And the thing I really like about good project managers that I've worked with in the past is that there's a sense of trust in the system that they create, as well as a feeling like of safety that like you can barrel down a path knowing that it's going to end up in a place where you're going to, whether it's shipping something to the customer or just like fulfilling your obligations to the company, like there is a clear rallying behind the impact, and someone's always doing that. But when it comes to us as individuals, this becomes far trickier, and that's part of kind of what I want to get at today. And so the next part of this is around this idea of like, well, what exactly are the kinds of tools that people use, like when we think of project management? I don't know about y'all, but for me, some of the ones that immediately come to mind are like Jira, Monday.com, Asana, those pivot table, and some people just use Trello, for example. And basically Gantt charts, that's like not necessarily a tool, but like a technique. And when we think of these software, right, a lot of times they're fairly complex, right? There's a decent learning curve. And most of us, especially as developers, are in here just basically filling out tickets and like moving them from columns. Oh, I see Notion. Yep, definitely. That's been really popular too. And so my question here then and thought process was at one point, okay, well, if this is working for project managers, this should work for me as well. And so to be fully transparent here, I at one point actually bought a Jira license, which for those if you haven't worked with Atlassian Jira, it is an enterprise level tool designed to like really like help companies and teams like make a ton of progress because there's a bunch of like tooling in there regarding like, issues, epics, tracking and whatnot. But I gotta tell you, I tried to Jirify my life. I did. I gave it a good solid effort of trying to put my life into different buckets, trying to put things into epics and trying to figure out how to group things. And golly, it was so much work. Oh, I see Cataboy here in the chat, Microsoft Project. Yep, good call out. And it was so much work to get it done. So much that I basically felt like I was doing a part-time job of merely trying to manage my life. That's not even getting things done. And why is this a problem? Well, the problem is that there's only so much you can do as far as planning and stuff before, frankly, you just have to live your life. You just got to do things. And I think this is why one of those people, or not one of those people, I think this is one of the reasons why most people don't really spend a lot of time thinking about this, is because the tooling is often designed for someone who basically embrace it as a full-time job, to do the proper SQL queries, to bring up the proper graphs, to determine velocity, et cetera, et cetera. And I always thought that was kind of weird, because while that's nice at the team level, I think if individuals could be provided the tools to be more effective in how they're managing things, I think we get like a really, call it powerful bubbling up effect over time, as like, because again, if you get the individual pieces to improve their efficiency and effectiveness of what they do, you get a larger effect. You get a multiplicative effect, in fact, across the organization. And again, all these tools, I've basically paid for most of these and tried them. They always tended to fall short from like the dichotomy of like either being super opinionated about how you do everything, or by the time you entered all your data in, which often took like a day's work easily, then by the time you were trying to like figure out how you could get the right data out, and then sometimes the data wasn't even available to you, so then you were like, oh gosh, I spent all this time entering data, and for what? And that's incredibly frustrating, all right? Because once again, the key here, right, and the key word of this entire topic and discussion is around this idea that as individuals, we are very ill-equipped to do this. And I know that some people manage, like, I've seen some really, how do I say this? I've seen some pretty incredible like life management systems, like especially with Notion's popularity. There's a lot of people with like the way they like do their task into their like monthly views, and then they get the yearly retrospective. But the one thing I've noticed with a lot of those systems though is that one, they tend to be very tailored to the person who like sort of the framework that's being designed. But then the problem is while Notion, you would argue, can then let you customize it from there, there's so many things regarding the primitives that like it's pretty daunting to do. Like it feels like you're gonna either break things, and there's a pretty big learning curve to making all that work. So I see here in the chat, use Asana, Trello, and to-dos for myself for personal stuff, same feels. Yeah, so to Jacob's point, like I have tried to do all the things, right? Like I've had like I tried the best to do app, to do best project management app, Trello. Like I kept trying to figure out how to get those things to work well together, but every time something fell short. And this was like a consistent frustration of mine. And so Radio Signal here saying, to-do tools are very useful to organize everyday life. My problem is that I lose focus at some point because not everything is planned with them. Then I lose focus. And exactly, I think Radio Signal sums it up really, really well. That's just it. Is that what I feel like is happening is that we are forced, and especially with the productivity systems that are out there, we are essentially forced to fragment ourselves between so many different tools, and then you have to figure out a way to synthesize all that data, which again, like as if we're probably not tired enough from like the work that we have to do on our day job, and on top of all the other things, then it's like, how do I synthesize this in a way that not only makes sense, but is actionable, right? That's part of really like call it my obsession with this space now, is because a couple sessions ago, we also talked about this idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And for those if you're joining the stream for the first time at this point, like at a high level, fixed mindset is around the idea that once you believe something, it is what it is, and there's no getting around it, right? You kind of like accept fate. Growth mindset is around the idea that like things can change with hard work. A lot of things at once, or what a lot of people consider like immutable or can't change, a lot of times those can actually improve. So things like intelligence are not fixed things. Those are things you can work at. You can get better at skills, right? And so I have this hypothesis, I haven't proven it yet, that traditional productivity tools actually, they encourage fixed mindset. And I know that's kind of a big claim when it comes to this, but I think the reason why I'm saying this is because most productivity tool is designed to have you thinking towards one specific way of doing things. So to kind of Radio Signal's point here, when you're in your to-do app, at least for most of the apps I've bought, and I've purchased a lot of them, like I even paid like $100 for like OmniFocus's app at one point, because like I don't know if it's that expensive anymore. It was like, or roughly that. Basically, I paid money. I was happy to pay money to make my system better, but it kind of, a lot of times, unless you really spend the time to really like do a lot of data entry or like manipulate things really custom wise, most apps end up having you think in a very linear kind of way. And when you think in a linear kind of way, my problem with that is that this doesn't allow you, like this doesn't do a good job at representing you as an individual. It's kind of like automating, like it's basically trying to say that, oh, you're a machine that needs to do this list of things, and this is like how you're going to do it. And so if you're lucky, you can maybe sort by deadline. You could sort by how much time you think it'll take done, and maybe you can sort it by context a little bit. But then when you do all this point to like enter all the data, what does this mean in the larger context of things? And so that here is to Radio Signal's point of like, when you start to be executing on tasks for the sake of executing, what does that mean in the broader picture of things? And I think a big theme that has always been with the work that I do with this lately and the questions I've been asking is around this idea of how do I create impact that aligns with my values? And I think most tools don't let us do that because they're designed to accommodate a very specific mindset. And so Jacob here in the chat, let's see. I think this is my kicker. Time put in doesn't match the value back out. That's exactly it. I think that's what I think is so ironic about a lot of these tools is that we spend so much time entering data, right? We create all these to-do lists. In fact, usually we try to tag them, we try to organize them, and then all that effort is constantly lost. That's what I think is so weird. And the best example of this actually is promotions in companies. The fact that employees have to often put together a promotion package, or in other words, like they have to argue for their promotion and they have to be the one to figure out what their achievement was, what they did, like what impact did they create? Like that to me is particularly odd in a company because didn't someone figure all that out at the beginning? Like, what isn't that why they assign you tasks? Isn't that why they like tell you to work on a specific thing? Like they should already know all the stuff you're doing. Why should an employee have to do all that work already? And so don't get me wrong, I think to Jacob's point, the reason why most of us don't spend the time to like create these elaborate systems is because it's just so much work to put into it. And a lot of times by the time you want to get that value out, either you can't or it's too limiting. And then you're just like, I just got to move on, right? Like the world's going to move on either way. So the next day starts and then guess what? The new to-do list. And then we just go through this cycle. And I think that there's got to be a better way. So ArkNECA here in the chat, task managers are becoming things of the past. Personalized dashboards that utilize multiple tools and help us with decision making are the future. Yes, I love that. Integrations, definitely, I'm loving that trend as well. And then the other thing that I'm hoping to see as well with the integrations though, is that I like to see tools thinking more holistically about us as individuals rather than constantly focusing on teams when they're doing things. And that's what I hope to see a new wave of. Like similar right now, we're seeing, I think, more software starting to consider local first or data privacy as an actual feature of their app rather than being like, everything's in the cloud. Like, that's nice, but what if I don't want it kind of thing. And so to ArkNECA's point about this, what I want to say is that I'd love to see software start to cater towards the individuals rather than teams. Because the reason why, and like my theory behind why so many apps always end up centered around teams, particularly productivity, is there's a lot of money in it, right? If you could arguably make a tool work for a team, there's like a way to like sell it to enterprise, and then a lot of these apps have investors backing them. So if you want the most like growth potential, then your trade-off is definitely like if your goal is maximum growth of revenue, selling to companies who have a lot of money already is definitely the best way to optimize for that. But for the, again, if you're new to the stream and like as part of my value, I am very much about the individual. So I'm like, as I build tools and thinking about things, like I'm of the opposite mindset where I think if you can learn to actually empower individuals, that is more effective for not only an organization, but for a community. And I'll even go as broad as say, like, for society as a whole, if we as individuals can better embrace concepts like growth mindset, emotional safety, and find ways to like build on those skills, I think we would have we would find that contribution will come in a much more organic way, and just like, I don't even know how to say this. Like there's something really beautiful about that world that I see, where if we can get more people to embrace these kind of thinking, I think we'd see we see that kind of effect now, even with like open source is a great example, I think, to some extent, of people who weren't focused on money. They weren't focused on, at least let's say a good majority of them. I can't speak for everyone. But like they were just trying to create good tools to empower people to do good work. They're like, why should people have to resolve this problem every single time, right? And so then they created something, and then they shared it with the world. And like so much of the web that we know today is built on technology that people built for free. And so, anyways, that's a whole nother topic in it of itself. Whoa, I see Alex here raiding in the chat. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the raid. Hello, horse friends. Hello, Ibalaya. Welcome. What were you all working on? Alex, I guess I'll give that. I know there's a little bit of delay in the stream. So, okay, so let me go back to the comments in the meantime. So Kata Boy here, or actually let me just, for those who've just joined, we're here, basically we're in Obsidian right now, if you're wondering what's up on the screen. And we're talking about some of the issues that we've seen with traditional project management theory. And we're basically kind of outlining and discussing this idea of project management and how we can better tailor it to the individual, so that over time we can enable people to do more things with their lives and create impact in ways that align with their values, which basically my hypothesis is traditional productivity tools don't do a really good job at that. So I see Yak Neve here in the chat. Hello, first time chat. Hello. Okay. So I've always admired the simplicity of David Allen and the pains he went through when he tried to create the perfect GTD app. In the end, the app never existed because you're organic and life changes every day and you need to adapt. So it's funny you mentioned David Allen and GTD. For those that don't know the acronym, that stands for Getting Things Done. He's one of like I won't say original, but like at least for me, he was one of the iconic personalities that like pushed this sort of framework for how to get things done. And fascinating read and incredibly influential, I think, at the time when I read it. And OmniFocus I think, is actually one of the tools that I feel got pretty close to the GTD methodology of how to like have like an overview of things and get things done. But like you said, like the perfect app never quite came out. And so I think that's part of like my search, and also part of what I'm exploring and kind of like basically trying to build with. So Josh here, also it creates the illusion that we can do actual work similar to tutorial help. Yeah, okay, so Josh here in the comments referring to the concept we were talking about earlier, where when you're in the mode of just executing, like when you're doing things to do things and you're busy for the sake of being busy, it feels productive, but at the end of the day, I don't know about you, I've definitely had multiple days where you're like, when someone's like, oh, what'd you do today? And you're like, I did stuff. I did something. And I think it's like, I think it's a bit of a travesty that happens. Like sometimes, don't get me wrong, you get caught up in the day, it's like just fatigue. But for me, it's been a cyclical problem where whether it's what did you do yesterday or what did you do last week, that like it just goes right over my head, right? And that's why performance reviews are particularly aggravating for me when I think about it, is that like I definitely did work, but now I have to spend the time. Like I already I already spent the time entering the data somewhere, because most companies, most teams are tracking your work somehow, because otherwise, how can anyone report on anything? Yet, when it comes down to reviews and performance and promotions, we have to go dig that all back up, and that's assuming it's going to be exposable to us in a way that makes sense. Most of the time, it's like it's just a series of things, and I think the systems and apps, there's gotta be a better way, is my hypothesis here. So yeah, it's a Kata Boy here. Kata Boy. I get a little overwhelmed with some of the quantified self dashboards I've seen. If we could get a simpler way to measure my impact that does not depend on biased metrics, that would be fantastic. That speaks to me on so many levels. So last week, if you missed it, it's on YouTube. We talked about metrics and success. And I think I'm gonna say Kata Boy. Kata Boy's point here is absolutely on point, in that if you have a tool that collects a bunch of metrics and just throws it at you, then you end up with information overload. And it's funny enough, I was just talking with a friend earlier today about this very topic, in that information is useful to a point, and then after that, it's just noise. And people get overloaded, and then the numbers don't really mean anything anymore. Whereas part of what I want to see in software going forward is this idea, to your point, of like finding a way to actually give meaningful metrics to people rather than just quantifying everything. So for example, right, a common example is where people want to try to figure out where their time went. That's a pretty simple one. And so most of us try to use our calendar to manage it. But I would argue that calendars, unfortunately, have this, they often give you a false sense of security about what kind of time you have. And that's always my problem with it. Because when someone's like, hey, do you have time on this day to do this thing? You're just, what do? You open your calendar, you look on the day, you see if there's a gap in between that time. And you're like, yeah, I got time. And then you book it. Except that doesn't consider all the other factors that come into it. And so the ability to contextualize metrics in a way that allows us to make decisions that create impact in ways that matter to us, that is the problem that I think we actually, by we I mean that I'm actually I'm not trying to say you should think about it too, but like I do think that the more we can think about this and find ways to move forward as a community, I just think it would be so much better. And so Yaknev here, the different tools project use drive me nuts. Thrown all my personal tools away for Obsidian. Yes. Okay. So right. So okay. I mean, we're here. We've been talking a lot of different things about tooling and stuff, and so absolutely right. And I have done so. That's just it, right? For those that don't know, Obsidian is a Markdown editor that basically. Well, it's more than a Markdown editor. It's a knowledge management system that uses raw Markdown all on your system, so it doesn't have any like third party cloud dependencies. So you basically truly own your data rather than some other tools where if their server goes down, good luck getting your data. So to Yakni's point, like I'm actually doing some level of project management within Obsidian right now, and basically the reason why. Well, actually, let me back it up. I'll explain a little bit more about how I do that when we get to a couple questions down, because it plays into some of the theories I've been developing around project management and how we could evolve it so that individuals can leverage these concepts and do more of the things they care about. So Radio Signal here, we partly use Mind Manager for projects, mainly to manage knowledge and tasks. Knowledge is an important factor in projects. Absolutely, right? And that's funny that you mentioned that. We talk about tasks, we talk about project management, and then obviously there's knowledge management. And all three of those things often like are hard to do well together. And we know that like apps like GitHub have abilities for you to do all of it in one place, but usually there's something incredibly not only lacking about it, but then more importantly, there's something not that intuitive about working in that way, because once again, it's forcing you to think in a specific mindset. Like GitHub projects, GitHub Wiki, GitHub issues. Yeah, those are good ways to track a coding project, but how might you like you can't really leverage that for like if you're like embarking on becoming a better artist. How would you necessarily use that in that scenario? Like it just becomes kind of awkward. And then how do you connect them in a way that makes sense? And I think this is why linked thinking within knowledge management systems have become so popular, is because people realize this issue, which I think, you know what, let's move on to the next question. And I think we can sort of expand on this. Okay. So, what was my question here? What roles are necessary for traditional project management to succeed? Okay. Yes. Oh, I know why I wanted to talk about this. Okay. Let's talk about this first real quick before we get to the next one. So when we think about project management, a lot of us see, okay, let me do it this way. When it comes to project management, let's start with the traditional model of a team, right? And if we think about it, what are the core roles on the team that's necessary in order for a project like the project management to succeed, right? So first of all, you obviously have the project manager, which is essentially the planner. They're responsible for moving all the things and getting the deadlines worked out. Then you have what I'll call like the executioner. I don't think this is that's not a good term. I'll just call it like the action person. All right, I'll just call it action person. The doer. Okay, this is the person responsible for doing the work, right? And again, we're talking high level here. So if we're talking for software development, the person doing the action is probably the engineer that's responsible, or the designer for coming up with the designs. Like they're making the project tangible for the real world. And so the planner relies on the action person to get that done. But what else do you need, right? You also need the ability to have someone who has the sort of the vision of what's going on, right? Because it's hard to plan for a destination if you don't know where you're going to end up, right? And a destination not being that's the end all be all, but it gives us something to head towards. It's, I mean, I don't know how many of you all have to deal with this, but a lot of times when I have to like ask my family like, oh, what do you want to get for dinner? What do you want to eat? And everyone's like, I don't know. It's like, we know we want to eat something, but like with no direction whatsoever, it becomes very difficult to get consensus. And so I think what I've joked about in the past, or not even joked, what I actually do with my family is I call it the game of three, where I give them some context. I'll go, okay, well, here's the game. You have three options. I'm going to pick out three. You have the option of either eliminating one, and then, or you can swap something out. And then when you get down to two, basically, you have to make a choice. So either you have to eliminate or you have to choose. And so the idea here being that you jog people's like what they actually want to do rather than this sort of like, I don't know what's going on. So anyways, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the visionary is responsible for guiding that direction and at least saying like, okay, this is where we're headed. And then certainly things can come up to change that, but at least it gives us a starting place to work towards. And so I would say these are like the three primary roles that we often think about when it comes to a successful team, like sort of movement towards something. But then there are two other roles that I do think are relevant to talk about too, which is that then you have the researcher. And the researcher role is because the researcher role is responsible for basically acquiring new information and using that to augment everything else. Because a lot of times when we do things in a vacuum, this is where we often like either come up with ideas that have already been done before, or for example, like we miss out on key information that would propel the project forward, right? Imagine if, what's a good example of this? I don't know. Let's just say you're looking to, I don't know, how's a good example of this? Okay, actually, no, this is relatable. If you're trying to build a library to do something and you realize you have to build it from scratch. So for example, you're like trying to figure out how to calculate time zones. You're trying to figure out how to like build a library that manages time. Well, the researcher might actually be able to tell you that like, oh, by the way, there is a whole dedicated library called date functions, which is amazing. You need to check it out because it's going to save you so much time because then you don't have to worry about that one functionality. The researcher here, pretty darn key. And finally, the other one that I'm going to just call it now, I'm going to call it the engine, or I'll call it the maintainer, is that within a project, you basically have this issue where like you're creating a lot of vehicles in order to propel something forward. But on the other hand, while you're acquiring new information, you're planning things, you're getting things done, you need someone to also maintain the things that are being done, like that are basically actively being done well. Wow, that was such a weird sentence. You need someone to maintain the engine that's running. So the equivalent of this within technology is probably like DevOps and like DevOps is a great example of this where like they have to make sure the servers are running, like they keep running. It's not even just like they run once, right? It's not like everyone's like, let's get ready. Servers are stood up. Yay, we're done. Walk away. Someone has to maintain that. Someone has to monitor it. And then they have to do things like fine tuning it because they'll notice that performance degradations are happening because something's being overloaded. So they have to like do some server load balancing and that kind of stuff. The maintainer is very different from the other ones, but it's a role that's often left out of the picture when we're thinking about this sort of like project management to succeed. Okay. So why is this question important though? The reason this is important is because my theory here is that one of the reasons we struggle as individuals with a lot of times this concept of project management is that it comes with the ability to recognize that we have these different parts inside of ourselves. And I'll talk about how that relates to us as individuals shortly. I see here in the chat, so Kataboy here, these traditional roles have been challenged by the emergence of Agile in the context of software development. Team members do not all fit individually in the same box. Absolutely. And so this is why I think one of the reasons I actually phrased the question this way, I think subconsciously, is these are not positions, right? It's not like the project manager is only the planner or the engineer is only the action person and then only the CEO is the visionary. Like everyone does contribute to it. And that's why I think it's a great call out that you have here regarding Agile, right? So let's see here, call out, great call out from Catboy79 on the evolution of traditional roles being filled by a single position and advent of ideas like Agile, right? Because at a high level, for those that don't know, waterfall is what most people know when it comes to project management, which is you say, I would like to get from A to Z. And so, start at A, good luck, and then report back to me when you get to Z. On the other hand, agile is sort of the opposite. It's like we're starting at A, we'd like to get to Z, but let's do a check-in at B, C, D, E. And then as we evolve, maybe we're like, oh, maybe we don't want to get to Z. Maybe we want to go to numbers instead. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, oh, we want to switch the colors, red, orange, yellow, etc. And so this call out here, I think, is good to the next part, which is, let's talk about this. All right. So project management. So we talked a little bit about some of my thoughts and the problems with it, but I want to call out something pretty specific with this. Bum, bum, bum. My highlighting is not working the way I want it to. Okay, there we go. Okay, great. So let's talk about the problem with traditional project management. All right. So what I'm going to do here is something that I'm pretty excited for. Actually, let me bump this up a little bit because I'm going to show you what I have in mind. Okay. So when we think of traditional project management theory, what are we taught? Well, first of all, we're taught that we have this idea of tasks, right? And so what I'm going to do here is we're going to use the Mermaid extension inside of Obsidian. And then by extension, I mean it's built as part of core. So we'll do a graph here. And what we have here is, let's do a task. All right, so we have tasks, right? These tasks represent building blocks. And, oh my gosh, yes. So I didn't realize this was you in the chat. So for basically, if you notice me doing the refactoring thing, I'm running into a little bit of an issue with the embed. And so this is a tip from Kataboy actually with refactoring. And I actually am going to dedicate, I think next session, we're going to do an Obsidian specific one because I've acquired a bunch of new tips and tricks that I'd love to share. And so this is one of them. So we'll talk more about that. But Kataboy, I did not realize that was you. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Yeah, Jacob, Mermaid is in core. So we're about to show you some pretty cool stuff. Honestly, I have so many things for Obsidian I want to do. And I realized Josh here was supposed to be asking some questions on Obsidian. So Josh, if you're still around, please don't hesitate to drop that in. If you went to sleep already, well, if you went to sleep, you wouldn't have heard this. But otherwise, yeah, we'll chat on another time. Okay, so we have tasks, and what do tasks talk to, right? Normally tasks feed into projects. Okay, then what? Well, then we know that projects, what do they feed into? Well, they often feed into what are essentially like the objectives for the organization. And then objectives, what do objectives feed to? Well, objectives then feed into like this sort of grand, like sort of, I don't know, business plans, right? Oh, wait, I forgot. I need to put this in strings if I have a space. What? Am I wrong? It did not like that. All right, let's just do business. Okay. So by the way, if again, just as like sort of a re-emphasis going on, what we're doing is we're using Mermaid syntax here inside of our Obsidian, which is just plain Markdown, in order to do sounds good. Josh, go ahead and drop some of the questions in the chat. I can add that to the note, and that way, in case you need to go sleep, no big deal. Okay, so right here, what we're having here, we're just basically doing some flowcharts using some plain Markdown syntax using Mermaid.js, and that's kind of what you're seeing here. My problem here with most project management theory is that it's pretty rigid. It's very, very top down, which hopefully is kind of like really evident in this diagram here. In that you do a task that falls into a project, the project falls into objectives, the objectives meet some sort of business goals. That's usually what it is. And then what I've realized recently, actually, when I kept trying to implement this in my own life, is that things aren't that linear. They rarely are. And when you try to force everything to fit into buckets like this, it just like there's a lot of friction and it feels really, really awkward. That's my kind of my problem with it. And so it's top down and it's fixed, right? So in some of these structures, you end up with a problem where like people are like, well, in order to have a business objective, you must have projects. In order to have projects, then you must have tasks. But sometimes tasks feed directly into objectives, and then projects might just feed directly into business. You might not have an objective for it yet. But if you have a linear structure of these sort of things, then what happens, right? Like, what do you do with this? And so the criticism here is actually very similar, funny enough, to the concept of note-taking, where it's the exact same problem of folders and directories, where if you have to fit everything into a specific folder, there comes a point where something doesn't fit the rule anymore. And I understand that at some point when we were sort of like approaching the field like sort of when it was very new and we were thinking of new ideas, it was hard to necessarily challenge these ideas. But as technology gets better, we're thinking of new ideas. Why don't we challenge this? Just as the way we're challenging the value of putting everything in directories. Again, folders are good up to an extent, but then what if we challenge the fact that it doesn't need to be that way anymore? And so I kind of want to talk about two different things here. One, let's talk about what I'm currently calling the TEPOD framework. All right. So the TEPOD framework is something that I've sort of like come up with as sort of a response to a lot of what we see inside of project management and like goal setting theories, right? There's like SMART goals, there's OKRs and these sort of things. And I want to say what kind of framework would work well for the individual, because I've tried the OKRs, I've tried a lot of them, and they always feel just too rigid. So, okay, what do we have? Okay, so let me do graph TD. TD, by the way, means top down. So it just means like do a graph that's top down. And so let's do a couple things. I'm going to do a couple. So we're going to have tasks. We're going to have projects. Okay, so tasks, epics, projects, objectives, and directions. Okay, so let me close all this other one actually to make it easier for everyone to see. Okay, there's my framework here. And so what's the base idea, right? So let's start with what we're familiar with. Well, tasks, they can feed into what are epics, right? And the reason I included epics on here is sometimes tasks are pretty big and they need to be broken down. And so epics to tasks, this is fairly common that we see in project management already, right? And epics usually go into projects. So we see tasks, epics, projects. But this is where I want to start showing the difference, is that with task, epics, projects, sometimes epics don't make sense, right? You just don't need to design this whole other infrastructure for something that might just be as simple as a task. Well, in that regard, I would say that then tasks should also be able to relate directly into projects. All right, and so let's keep up with this. Now that you have projects, right? Projects often feed into your objectives, right? That's usually what happens. In other words, like the objectives you're trying to achieve for a certain time, if you have a concrete way of doing it, this is great. This works really, really well. And so can I do like this? I forgot how you do two-way arrows. I'll deal with that later. And then finally, what I would argue is that objectives feed into your directions. And so the directions here in this framework are things that aren't very tangible. So when you say things like, I want to become a better developer, that's the direction you're heading towards. I want to be a better artist. I want to do this. Like they're almost kind of soft as a goal, but this is a good thing because a lot of times we don't know how to define things or frame things. And so we have a feeling about what we want to do. We might want to be a better musician or whatever. And so from there, we can then, this is one way to sort of go down sort of the framework. So directions is something that I'd like to see. Oh, no. Hold on, sirens. Okay. So, and then, okay, where was I? Okay, directions, right? So directions help give you a sense of where you're trying to go. This is your compass. So when you're thinking about the project management theory for individuals, this is where we can just sort of establish higher level things that we care about. I would like to spend more time with my kids. I would like to spend more time playing video games and just relaxing, being better at self-care. Whatever it is, directions just help like put a goalpost of what you're thinking about, right? Objectives are one of those things that are more concrete as far as what you're trying to do. This is more analogous to what a lot of us are familiar with as SMART goals. So those have like concrete measurements. It might be something like, I'd like to be able to make an extra $10,000 this year from side projects. Like those are very concrete. Those are measurable. You can actually see how those are going. Projects, on the other hand, though, are kind of interesting because then projects are what like kind of we tend to do. So that's when you like take on an open source project, when you decide to do a side project. All of these consider projects. But this is where, again, we're going to talk about folders, right? Sometimes projects don't have objectives, at least not yet. And I think that's okay, right? I think some traditional project management theory would say that it has to have an objective, otherwise you don't know what you're doing. No, life is a lot more murky than this. I think, where was this around? I want to say it was Yakniv who said this. No. Okay, I'm not going to scroll through this. But earlier in the chat, we had this sentiment around the fact that life is changing and evolving. And so rather than constantly forcing ourselves into a box, the system itself should be adaptive too. And so this is why I would argue then, for example, projects should also just be able to go straight into directions. There's no reason why you need to have an objective every single time. But then let's build on this one step further. Sometimes you don't even have a project. Sometimes you just have tasks that support. Wait, I've been coding too long. I did double ampersand. Some directions are just things you're gonna do, right? If I want to, for example, I'm like trying to get better at playing ukulele. My task for the direction is practicing 15 minutes, like every day or, twice a week, 3 times a week. That's it. I don't have objectives and projects and epics, and I don't like try to make my ukulele learning like incredibly formalized. Like, sure, I can do that and evolve it when the time comes, but by creating a system, and don't get me wrong, this doesn't exist anywhere yet. You'd have to like do some finagling, and I'm working on something in case it's not surprising. I'm talking a lot of theory with you all. And so, yeah, so Kataboys here, to your point, is, hold on, let me back that up a little bit. Oh, Jacob here. Two-way arrow. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe if I did, directions to tasks. Okay, there we go. It sort of does it. It just does like a two-way thing. I don't know. That good enough though. Well, directions, tasks. Anyways, so I'll leave this up because it's kind of a fun illustration. So to Kataboy's point here, the getting things done philosophy that we talked about earlier by David Allen does talk a little bit about this. And to say that, and to be very clear, this framework that I'm iterating on, it's not done, is inspired by a lot of what has come before. And so I make this very clear. This is not like something entirely original that no one's ever thought of. It has flavors of different systems that I've used over time and trying to figure out the best of both worlds. And so for those that want to look more into it, basically in getting things done, there's a concept of this sort of 50,000 feet overview, which is like, I guess, the equivalent of my directions of things you kind of want, and then how you get more granular with it is that's like sort of where it gets in a gray area in my opinion, which is why I'm trying to figure out a model and framework that makes more sense for individuals, because that way, one, you create things as it makes sense. Because again, I've been testing out this idea, and so sometimes certain projects are so large that they deserve to have epics. They need them because otherwise it's impossible to group your tasks in a way that are meaningful. But I also have projects that are small enough that like epics just don't make sense. Like I'm going to arbitrarily create like milestones when the truth is I just need to do like 10 items and then the project is complete. I don't need that. But a project is like a year long. Epics might make a little bit more sense to actually make it feel like actually making progress towards something. And so part of my theory around all of this is the fact that as you can see, the whole idea here is just like linked thinking. Nothing is actually confined to the top-down hierarchy. I'm hoping the arrow kind of illustrates the fact that it feeds into whatever makes the most sense in that moment. And what I think good project management for individuals allows us to do is to grow our systems organically as they make sense, rather than forcing ourselves to conform to some specific model within a specific framework. And so let's see, JE litter here with maybe that. That's what I thought too. I kind of thought that if I did this, both arrows would show up, but it doesn't look like that's happening, because look, if I do epics to projects like this, nothing is changing. So, oh well, not a problem. Okay, so the other thing I want to cover for today is we've talked about this other thing. I'm calling it TEPOD right now. I guess I could call it Depot. I know that like if you arrange the Depot kind of works, but for those wondering why I'm calling it TEPOD right now is because TEPOD is actually the literal incremental growth of a unit within project management that I'm seeing for individuals. In that it can go from a task to an epic to a project to an objective to a direction. And then what I'm thinking as well is that those things can evolve organically. So in other words, tasks, sometimes eventually we originally scope them as tasks, they become projects, right? And tooling, in my opinion, should make it easy for you to do that sort of not only conversion, but still maintain the relationships in a way that are meaningful. And so, again, mental models are helpful for us to feel the movement and progression of things. But in my mind, it's like notes, right? Like we do categorize notes to help us make sense of things. But in the end, are these not all ultimately like markdown documents? They make up this unit, and then we use these sort of mental models and frameworks to help us make more sense of things. Let's see. Cowboy here. I think you should totally go for it, Ben. All the existing systems are like revolving concepts intertwined. Maybe you code a train of thought that resonates with people. I don't know, maybe. And that's part of the reason I want to talk about this stuff with y'all and share my thoughts is because these theories, I'm still testing them out. And more importantly, like if my goal is to empower individuals to help better live out the unique tapestry that is each individual of skills, of backgrounds, of ideas, then the theories behind it need to allow for that adaptation rather than what I find a lot of enterprise software does, which is like they're usually trying to cater for one specific model. And I want to help build a system that lives and breathes with its user in a way that's not confined to someone else's agenda. Okay, so before I wrap up for today, the one last thing I do want to cover, because, and unfortunately, Josh, looks like we don't have time for this on Obsidian. But Josh, what I promise you I will do is I'm going to add all of this to the backlog. And next week, we're going to do a whole Obsidian session, and I will include your questions in there. So hang on tight. If anything's pressing, I'll DM you on Twitter, and we'll chat. But in the meantime, I'm sorry about that. We will get to it later on. Okay, so the spear model. Oh yeah, I actually had outlined this a little bit before, but I'm gonna bump it down a little bit. So the spear model is something I've been thinking about a lot, and it relates to this idea of roles. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, actually, regarding what makes for a successful project management team to succeed. And so one of my theories with individuals as we go through life, producing things, doing things, is that we often see ourselves as a single individual unit, right? I am Ben, and Ben wants to do these things. But what I want to propose here is that one of the reasons this becomes tricky to manage over time is because what we're not realizing is that we actually have different parts of ourselves that are often competing for different priorities depending on the context we're in. So earlier, what did we talk about? We talked about the different roles, right, that are successful for project management. Talked about the planner, the actionary, the visionary, the researcher, the maintainer, right? How does this reflect in the spear model that I'm sort of proposing? Well, let's start with the simplest part, right? So if we take the idea of an airplane, and this was a model that actually I learned from Ali Abdaal. And so actually, if I remember, I'll add it to the resource for it. So his was I think he called it jet, but I'm going to call it airplane. The airplane is actually not even the airplane, the pilot. Let's start with the pilot. P in the spear model is pilot. The pilot is responsible for basically mapping out how we get from destination to destination and how we do that safely, right? And so the pilot is responsible for getting us from point A to point B. This is this connects to the planner, right? Because that's what the project manager is trying to do. They're trying to figure out, can we get from here to here within a certain allotted amount of time and resources? Do we have enough gas? Do we have et cetera, weather conditions, et cetera? Okay. Then on top of that, then the A is the airplane mode, right? Essentially the airplane passenger is that a lot of times at this point, once you've gotten on the plane, you're basically just in the role of being on the journey. So basically the equivalent of this is the action person in the other model, because you've been given your set of you're on the plane at this point, right? The project manager has said, this is what we're trying to do. These are the features that have been prioritized. Let's figure out a way to get there. Let's go. Well, you're basically along for the ride at this point. And so the action person is responsible for being on the ride and sort of carrying out these things and basically experiencing the journey along the way. Okay. Then the other part of us that is often taught, and so actually let me go back to the airplane mode for us as individuals is when we're basically in the to-do list mode. We have a list of things to do and we're just like, check, can't do it, check. We're just focused on following the journey. And the pilot in this scenario is the person who's like planning out your day to be like, this is what you have to do. This is your list. This is the equivalent. Then the other one he had was the engineer. Airplane model SEAR. I think he had the engineer. I think he's the one that had the engineer. So the engineer for an airplane is the one who's responsible for making sure that the plane is actually maintained properly. So this is the equivalent of the maintainer. And this, as an individual, this is the part of us that has to like pay bills, make sure like try to clean up the place, make sure that if we want to eat dinner, that if all the dishes are dirty, that we have to wash the dishes to use them, or they help to maintain our systems, that like we make sure we wash the dishes consistently so we never have to run out of dishes. Like the engineer is responsible for this, and this is a part of ourselves that oftentimes I would say gets neglected because the other ones are often louder. But anyways, to continue on with the SPEAR model, so we have the PEA. This is where then the researcher is still the R. So I'm basically saying the researcher here in this model, in the SPEAR model, is responsible for getting new information. So these are the ones that this role is responsible for augmenting the plane and new technologies. And so basically, as an individual, what does that mean? Well, that means that you are going to be able to, like, you're learning new things. This is like the learner and bringing that stuff in, right? And finally, the last one, which I'll cover at a high level because I had to run. The last one here is, sorry, not SPEAR, SEER. This is the visionary, ultimately. This is the one who's looking back, and this is when we are trying to say, what's our 5-year plan? What's our 10-year plan? And where am I trying to go? What do I want to do with my career? And these are the parts that, again, I think we'll have to do a dedicated session on this because I have to head out. But this is the kind of stuff that I think that if we need to have a tool that helps us to navigate how these different parts talk to each other, because ultimately they each have their own priority, and that's what ultimately matters in the end. So with that, let me switch back over to the camera. All right. Thank you everyone for hanging out today. As always, any resources I have will be included in the show notes, and please feel free to leave comments down below. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.